All right, welcome everyone to today's Lightbox LinkedIn Live event, PFAS Due Diligence, Part 1, ESA Scoping Strategies. My name is Diane Crocker, and on behalf of Lightbox, we're really happy to have you all here as 2022 comes to a close. PFAS is really such a hot topic for our industry right now, with so many moving pieces as regulations take shape and best practices emerge. Everyone is asking similar questions about how to frame conversations about PFAS during due diligence, and that's why we're all here today. So housekeeping item, if you have any questions at all as we proceed through this, please go ahead and post your question in the comments field and we will address them time permitting. So please join me and my colleague, Alan Agadoni, here today as we introduce our panelists. We have John Kitchen and Ned Whitty here with us today. John is a principal with Civil and Environmental Consultants with over 25 years of experience in environmental consulting. John has worked on a number of PFAS sites, and he recently completed an extensive database study of PFAS sites here in New England. Also here with us today is Ned Whitty. He is a shareholder in the Environmental Strategies Practice Group of Godfrey & Kahn, a law firm based in Milwaukee. Ned has broad, nationally recognized experience in counseling clients concerning PFAS. In late 2020, Ned was selected by the Biden-Harris Agency Review Team for the federal EPA to consult on PFAS issues. So we're very grateful that he made time to be here with us today. So with that, Alan, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, thanks, Diane. Hello, everybody. Hi, John and Ned. Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. So we're going to be about 30 minutes here talking about the following topics. We're going to start off with a quick level set on scoping Phase I, because we realize that a lot of our viewers have a broad range of experience. So we're going to start with that. Then we're going to switch over to exploring how emerging contaminants may or may not fit in a particular project. And we'll finish up with a quick discussion on how PFAS are presented in reports. And now I'll make a quick note, like it says in the slide, we're going to have a part 2 on this where we'll go into a little bit deeper dive on Phase II investigations following a Phase I. All right, John, let's kick things off.
Sure, let's just set the stage a little bit. Happy to be here today. Let's just talk a little bit about why clients conduct environmental due diligence. If you're looking at ASTM, a lot of it focuses on CERCLA liability and qualifying for those protections under CERCLA. But in reality, I think many of us may know that clients do due diligence for a variety of reasons. That might be part of the reason, but it might be, anything from the bank told us we had to do it to a real desire to understand risk, maybe even at a minute level, to some clients that may just want to know about really big problems. Next slide. And so emerging contaminants fit into this context where we're trying to provide these services to our clients. And the new ASTM standards do comment on emerging contaminants. It does exclude those emerging contaminants that are not CERCLA hazardous substances, but it acknowledges that the public may view some of these contaminants as hazardous substances, right? And I mean, just think about that. If you're a consultant, it's hard to tell your client, well, it's not a hazardous substance, so it's excluded, when that's what they're hearing in the news every day about these new compounds that are the biggest concern. So they can be included as non-scope considerations, and I would say especially in states which have cleanup levels and which are going to require cleanups. I think we've got to keep in mind that these emerging contaminants may be listed as hazardous substances in the future, and it's really quite likely that they will be. So there's a lot of emerging contaminants out there. I won't list all the ones that are here. You can read them for yourself. But I think one of the things I wanted to comment on is what gives an emerging contaminant staying power, right? Why do we hear about some emerging contaminants and then they kind of come and go, and other ones maybe are going to stick around? Well, a contaminant that's toxic, a contaminant that's mobile, a contaminant that is recalcitrant, doesn't really break down. And I would add a contaminant that, captures the media and maybe has a scary name. All of these criteria really contribute to whether a emerging contaminant sticks around. And one thing that you'll find is all of those criteria checked off when it comes to PFAS. So you do have an emerging contaminant that really is likely to stick around. So why is it so tricky dealing with PFAS as an environmental consultant or environmental professional doing due diligence? Well, part of it is regulation is often being led by the states, and it's variable. So you've got some states with standards, some states without standards, some are enforcing those standards, some aren't enforcing those standards. Some are saying maybe we're going to enforce those standards next year. So that becomes a challenge. And you've got a situation where regulation is outpacing science. You've got a lot of public concern relative to PFAS. And you've got clients that come with different perspectives. I've got clients who will say PFAS is completely overblown, and it's not really a risk. And I've got other clients that feel the opposite. But regardless of what they might personally feel about health risks, the business related risks at their particular location, at their particular project site are real.
All right, let's talk a little bit. Ned, I got a question for you. So thanks, John. Over a third of our respondents to our recent benchmark survey, where for the first time we asked questions about PFAS as a part of the standard scope of work for an ESA and how it fit into the reports. We had a panel on November 10th webinar where we talked with Phase I reviewers who are working with large banks and institutions, and they were reporting back that even though a third of the respondents to our survey said they're incorporating PFAS as a standard, they're seeing in the reports scope of work and reporting that's all over the place, and it frequently doesn't address adequately what their concerns are about PFAS. So Ned, what are your thoughts on whether EPs should include PFAS in their ESAs, or always include it, or just conditionally include it?
Thanks, Alan. And thanks to Lightbox, Diane, John, for the opportunity to be here today. Really appreciate it. I think that John did a great job of setting the table there on what goes into Phase I and, why parties perform Phase Is. It really is about identifying risk, but it also can be those parties who want to go all the way to basically, achieve all appropriate inquiry to ideally qualify for some of those exemptions from liability. So, that's why the Phase I is such an important tool and why due diligence is so important. And I think that the reason things are all over the place, frankly, Alan, is because we've got some sort of lack of clarity right now. We've got, an old standard that has been used for years, since 2013, a new standard that was initially approved by EPA, and then they withdrew their approval in response to critical comments about that new standard. We've got, now suggestions of using both. How do I figure out which one to use? Do I borrow from one? Do I use the other one? And all of that leads to an issue of uncertainty. And so that's what lawyers really, either hate or thrive off of, because the uncertainty breeds the need for interpretation and help. But that's really where we are at this point in time. And I think the reason things are all over the place is that people are trying to deal with this very vexing compound, PFAS, which is, still evolving through regulation. And as John pointed out, we've got kind of a myriad of different state regulations, and then we've got the federal, train coming sometime within the next year, give or take. So it's a really challenging circumstance and landscape within which to operate.
Right, and John, back to you. As far as you're an EP, you're fitting PFAS into your ESA scopes right now. At a high level, we're going to talk in detail more about some of the factors involved, but how are you fitting it in? Is it conditional? What are things that you consider at a high level?
Right. I think it is conditional. We're not fitting it into every Phase I, although I would say we're thinking about it at every Phase I. We're talking to our clients on every Phase I. Because it does warrant that level of discussion. It's not, I think, something that you just sort of exclude and then forget about. depends upon the state maybe a little bit. So some of those conditions might be where the property is located, property's history, the client's risks and risk tolerance. And the other thing I would say is, if you are excluding it, I don't think it's a sort of set it and forget it kind of scenario. Like, you may see certain things and you need to be aware of certain things where you might say, well, maybe I need to revisit that conversation with my client about whether they wanted to talk about PFAS or not.
Right. And Ned, so kind of rounding out and closing out this issue of scoping of phase one, what kind of things, once an EP determines that they want to include PFAS, should they be doing to protect themselves and their clients?
So I think from an EP's point of view, I think the important thing to do is to clearly identify what the scope of work is in writing as part of the proposal and authorization to proceed. So I think that, a company like John's really needs to identify, we are going to be following this E1527 ASTM standard, whether it's 13, 21, both of them, and then what the specific non-scope considerations or other activities are going to be as well. So that if that includes PFAS, it should be spelled out that it is something that they're going to be looking into. And John, your company may have some details on how you sort of articulate that in a proposal or in an engagement. But, I think, Alan, the bottom line is that clarity really is very valuable, because when someone comes back later and says, you didn't look for this, or we found it now, why didn't you find it? It's nice to have that contract as clear as possible.
Right. And consistent with all your other documentation too, right? Your proposal. Yeah. Good advice. Okay, look, let's transition into this slide a little bit more. We'll go a little bit deeper. John, let's talk again about these factors that you use to consider whether you're determining if PFAS fits into your scope of a particular project. Maybe talk a little bit more detail, and then we can kick that around a little bit.
Sure. I think one of the first factors is property location, and most importantly, what state you're in, and what the regulatory context is in that state. When we think about location, it's not just state, it's environmental setting, right? Are you in an area where, depth of water is 5 feet and it's all sand and people use it for drinking water, right? Which gets to receptors. What receptors are there? And drinking water is the big one right now for PFAS. I mean, I think eco remains to be seen, but really whether you've got a lot of drinking water use in your area is going to drive a lot. And then the facility type, right? I mean, if you've got a client that's buying a residential property that's always been residential in, I can't think of the state, but Idaho, right? It's going to be different than I'm going to buy a fire training academy in New Hampshire, right? That's a different level of conversation you're going to have with your client about whether or not to include PFAS. And their proposed property use is important too, because if there's some risk of release of PFAS, or if there's some particular concerns, are they going to not only buy a property that may have some of this contamination, but are they going to also potentially contribute during their ownership? Known or suspected sites around there or around the property, or known contamination, right? If you're a situation where maybe you've got an industrial property that has some potential to discharge PFAS, but you already know that the water supply down gradient is impacted, you might have to look at that a little bit differently.
Right. So before we move on, Ned, do you have anything to add on that? Or what if a client is hesitant and is resistant to including PFAS? What should the EPs do in that situation from your perspective?
Well, I appreciated a comment that John made earlier about, when you do a phase one, John, I mean, your team is walking over across a facility or a site, your eyes are open and you're aware of what you might see. And so the user might say, no, I don't want to include PFAS. I don't think that's a risk or an issue. But if you happen to notice that there is a Class B firefighting system, or if you happen to notice that, there was evidence of a fire, I mean, those are things that you'll take into account and that, will come back. So I think, Alan, responding to your question, I think that if a user says, I don't want to include that, I mean, ultimately that's their choice, but I think they ought to understand what the risks are of not including it, because what we know today as the regulatory landscape may be changing within states and certainly at the federal level also. So I think that, among the myriad of reasons that people perform phase ones, one that I frequently observe is kind of preparing for an exit strategy, creating a baseline and understanding what the conditions were as of the time that they came in. And if we're looking at a regulatory issue of PFAS that may be changing between acquisition and divestiture, it would be wise to understand what the conditions were when someone took control of that property.
Right. And of course, John, I'm assuming at some point, if just you and your client don't agree on whether or not PFAS should be included, there's some kind of documentation, at least on your end, to note what the context of the conversation was, and what was said, and those kinds of things. Does that make you a little bit more comfortable with the situation?
Sure. I mean, you're going to want, as we discussed before, your proposal to reflect what you and your client have agreed to on what's included. And I think as Ned and I both alluded to, it can change over time. And I think the analogy I was thinking of is, I'm sure every environmental professional out there has done a phase one where they excluded asbestos and then walked into a basement where they immediately want to turn around because there's just, things, you don't know if it's asbestos unless you test it, but you kind of know, right? And you've had those situations where you have to say to your client, I know that it's outside my scope and I know that we're excluding asbestos, but you might want to look into this a little more carefully, right?
There you go.
And it remains outside your scope. And then you can have a conversation with them whether they want you to do that or they want someone else to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And Ned, so middle of the project, John finds a red flag, something related to PFAS that really escalates things from what he was considering at the beginning of the project. What's your strategy or thought about how you proceed with a situation like that where things just pop up? What happens next? What should an EP be doing?
Well, I mean, I'll speak from the perspective of representing the user. So if I'm representing a buyer of a property who's commissioned a phase one, or if I'm representing the lender who is underwriting that acquisition, I want to know that kind of information, and so that's valuable. And I would imagine that if there was a circumstance where a red flag came up as sort of obvious as what John just alluded to in the basement with the asbestos, that related to PFAS, for example, then I would want them to adapt their scope. I'd want to amend the engagement to have them take care of that. Now, if I'm a seller and I'm trying to get a deal done, I'm not trying to sweep things under the carpet, but I also am trying to, there is an art to performing a phase one. And so I think that a seller's phase one is going to try to characterize and condition things so that it's not going to be as alarming as maybe a buyer's phase one might present things. So it's going to be a different dialogue with a selling user of the phase one services.
John, anything to add to that? Your experience where things pop up, because those things do happen, right?
Right, absolutely. And there's always sort of a little bit of difference between that the buyers and sellers' desires, and I think the ASTM standards trying to keep them on the rails in terms of within certain bounds within the buyers versus a seller's phase one. But where you're dealing with something outside of that, certainly I think most sellers are going to say, well, if there's no standard in my state, why bother? Or maybe there is a standard in the state. We don't need to for ASTM, but a buyer might feel quite differently.
Yeah,
exactly. All right.
And I guess Alan, just to add one point to that. I think that's a really important point. John is in a state which has been, at the forefront of developing. Massachusetts has been at the forefront of developing regulatory standards. Here in Wisconsin, we are not as far down the path. We actually have had proposed regulations go off the rails. And so, there's a high degree of uncertainty here. So it's a challenging issue to address in a phase one.
Always. And perhaps even getting more challenging before we go on to reporting. We had our first in our series on PFAS. We presented information about a bunch of new data that's coming down the pipeline that we've already included in our standard reports. There's federal data. We obviously have a lot of states that are reporting. There's private sources now that are reporting information that might be useful for phase one. So in this environment where we have an increasing amount of information, I think we're going to be all challenged with figuring what is a risk and what is a potential condition prior to even getting reports. And then once you get them, after you comb through all this information, how do you differentiate between potential, suspect, and known PFAS sites? I mean, maybe we can get into some of that in part 2, but that's going to be a big challenge for all of us. All right, let's talk a little bit about reporting issues. Again, I'll go back to our benchmark survey, where 7% of EPs said that they have added either a special PFAS section or language to their ESA reports. So, maybe the rest are just adding language when they actually include PFAS in their reports and don't have it in there otherwise. John, where do you sit on that? Do you have some standard report with boilerplate language, or do you tailor it based on project?
Yes, and environmental professionals love boilerplate language, right? So we don't have boilerplate language yet. It is tailored project to project. We certainly have examples. We can look at prior phase ones and say, well, we handled it this way in this case. There is a lot of customization with regard to whether you're going to look at PFAS or not, because you're also thinking about, what level of a PFAS issue are you concerned with, right? You've got, what is that de minimis condition that's out there, So there's that. I will say that in terms of boilerplate language, we do generally, in the exclusions of our report, exclude emerging contaminants, except where otherwise noted. And what we'll usually do when it comes to PFAS is put commentary. If we are going to have commentary, it's going to be under the business environmental risk sort of section at the end.
Right. And so you're doing your data evaluation, you're either doing it yourself or you're looking over somebody's shoulder. What are some of the things that, as you're reviewing what's been done on a project, that kind of start throwing flags for you, where you're going to be calling out a PFAS condition versus just saying, well, we've got some indicators here, but don't really see anything concrete?
Right. So I think the biggest things, for the real big ones, are the ones that are your sources that you're hearing about in the news, your fire training academies, your airports, your manufacturers that use PFAS, right? I mean, if you say, it's maybe the analogy that goes with the asbestos in the basement is, they say it's manufacturing, but we don't want to look at PFAS, and you find out that they're coating fabrics and they're on a septic system, right? Mm-hmm. Boy, we really should have a discussion, right? Because this could be a problem. So that's really, we're looking at those industries and those uses that have been found to be most problematic, right? I mean, somebody could make a case, any of our residences that has a septic system probably has some PFAS, right, in the groundwater, right. But we're not going to that level.
Good point, Ned. What are you seeing in the reports that that come across your desk when you're representing either a buyer or a seller, with regard to how EPs right now are assessing PFAS in their reports? Anything in particular sticks out to you?
Sure. Yeah. When I'm reviewing a phase one, I mean, what I'm looking for is the correlation between the narrative in the phase one and what the environmental professionals said that they were going to do, consistency with the ASTM standards, and then a clear explanation of what was done, what wasn't done, whether there were any data gaps, and whether what the conclusions are in regard to particular issues. So I think that John laid it out pretty clearly, as to how that is addressed and reviewed. On top of some of the other sort of indicators that I think are out there, that could drive a PFAS type wreck, I think that one of the really big issues that we're seeing and that we're working with some clients on are Class B firefighting systems, and they are in facilities where there's a risk of what's known as a Class B fire. That's a fire in flammable materials, but these are systems that are good business. I mean, it made sense to have a Class B firefighting system if you had a risk of that type of a fire. And having such a system is a positive check mark when it comes to qualifying for insurance also. So, there are a lot of reasons people had them, but they also tested them. And, so what we're seeing is there are some facilities where on a routine basis, perhaps annually, PFAS containing AFFF was intentionally discharged on the ground surface or in a facility and evacuated out to the storm sewer or ground surface. Those are issues that are, big problems because they can lead to concerns related to groundwater impact. And if you have one of those facilities nearby a public drinking water source, you've got indicators that really lead to potential for significant concern.
Absolutely. John, anything to add on that?
No, I think that's dead on, and the significant current concern was what kind of clicked in my head because I think there are some environmental professionals who are going to want to say, "Oh, it's evolving too much. I really don't want to deal with it." And I think the reason that you want to deal with it is because of the level of concern. Being in one of those states that's sort of at the forefront of regulating this, the level of liability may dwarf other things that you're looking at in your ASTM Phase I.
It's always a concern. Look, we're almost to the half hour. So one of the things we're going to do, Diana's been monitoring the chat and the comments for questions. We'll get to those in just 1 second. As a wrap up, is there anything else you guys want to add before we get to the Q&A? John? Ned?
No, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. Yep.
Okay. Diane, how are we doing on questions or comments?
Yeah, we haven't gotten any in, so I think you guys addressed everybody's questions. I thought the most interesting takeaway here from both you, Ned, and John is the fact that the situation's changing so quickly that you can't assume that the regulatory environment at the point of selling a property is the same as it was at the point of purchase. And that's, that although we feel like we're on a train when the track is still being built, I think you've given everyone some food for thought in terms of how to have conversations and frame the risk, even though there's still a lot of uncertainty. One question did just come in, Alan, which is, what if you have a fire and the fire department responds? Who then is responsible for addressing PFAS conditions?
Ned?
I can answer from personal experience. Here in the state of Wisconsin, it's a bit of an evolving issue. And right now, if a fire department responds and uses a PFAS-containing product to put out the fire, unfortunately, where we are right now is that the property owner bears some responsibility in the state of Wisconsin because we have a pretty black and white spill law, as we call it, and the party that is in possession and control of the hazardous substance that's been discharged is responsible. We also have litigation right now on whether or not our Department of Natural Resources went through proper rulemaking to establish PFAS as a hazardous substance. It's a real mess here. But answering the fire issue, that's kind of unfortunately the way that it's come down. Typically, people will be able to respond fast enough that this isn't a very extensive problem. But nevertheless, it's a little bit alarming when you hear that the homeowner can be responsible. And one other anecdote. My colleague has a grandson who loves fire trucks. And so he was at a fire station locally and just began talking with the fire chief about PFAS. And the fire chief said, "Oh yeah, we add it to every tanker truck we've got. So when we show up at a fire, just a residential combustible wood fire, they're spraying a product that contains detectable amounts of PFAS, which is alarming."
Yeah, that circles back to our benchmark survey. We had a question about some of the sites that people were considering to be the most potentially problematic, and fire sites, fire testing sites, fire training sites, all those things, fire systems all seem to be leading the pack. So that's very consistent with what we're hearing back from the community.
Yeah, Alan, we just got a question for you to field. Ahead of that, we will be making a replay available to everybody. So if you wrote in and asked about that, we will make sure that you get a replay. Alan, someone wants to know what is the current thought in terms of the timing for EPA approving ASTM 152721?
All right, you want to cover that or do you want me to do it?
Our understanding is that they are queuing up a Federal Register notice to be published early in the year that approves of the 21 standard as a tool for meeting AEI under CERCLA. So it should be, I would say, over the next month or so, we should hear something.
Right, and we'll be queued up and ready to go when that comes out. We'll make sure that there's a link to the ruling. The rule, I'm sure there'll be some interesting details in there we'll want to talk about. But so shortly after the holidays, we can expect something from EPA on that. So thanks for Thanks for the update. And John, Ned, I just want to say before we wrap up, thank you so much for participating. Stay tuned for our part 2, where we're going to take some of these issues and go a little deeper, talk a little bit about what happens when you identify a PFAS condition and how that scoping happens and what are some of the strategies and thoughts there, kind of along the lines of what we did today. So I think that'll be super interesting. We've got your information here for folks who want to reach out to you directly. And Diane, do we have anything else we want to talk about? How about our PFAS Resource Center?
Yep, that was the last point. So we will thank you, first of all, to Ned and John. We really appreciate you being here, and you covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. We do have a new resource page on PFAS, so please make sure that you're checking back there. As the speaker said today, the field is changing very quickly, so we will continue to host events like this and post resources on that page as conditions change. And thank you all for being here, and I wish everybody happy holidays.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.